90 minutes aside. Thank you, Sue. To talk about low impact solar development opportunities in Illinois, particularly on degraded or contaminated lands such as brownfields, landfills, and mine lands. We are talking about this today because Illinois, as you all likely know, is the nation's fourth largest coal producing state with a legacy nearly 2 centuries long of coal mining and over 200,000 acres of land that have been degraded by mining and other manufacturing activities. And the federal infrastructure bill presents an historic opportunity and investment to reclaim and assess these lands, and this opportunity can bring economic development, jobs, clean water, and revitalization to energy communities across Illinois. And included in the bipartisan infrastructure law is billions that also goes towards the cleanup of brownfields, Superfund sites, orphan gas and oil wells, and landfills. So today we're going to be talking about what are these opportunities? What are these degraded lands? Who has regulatory authority over them? And we've got 4 expert speakers who will be covering these issues with you. Today's workshop is brought to you by Great Plains Institute. Next slide. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with GPI, we are a nonprofit based in Minneapolis. We do work nationwide, but our deepest roots are in the Midwest and in Minnesota specifically. And we work across the 5 emission sectors to accelerate the transition to a net zero carbon emissions planet that works for the benefit of people, the environment, and the economy. And we largely do this by taking our technical expertise and bringing it to convenings and facilitation. Next slide. All right. Before we get to today's agenda, this is workshop 1 of a 3-part workshop series on the solar opportunity on brownfields, mine lands, and landfills. So this is workshop 1. We also have workshop 1A scheduled for next Wednesday at 3:30 for 30 minutes. And that's just an opportunity to continue the conversation from today. It's really an office hours Q&A opportunity. So please join us next Wednesday for half an hour if you're able with your lingering questions. Workshop 2 will be sometime in mid-April, and that will cover the tools, resources, incentives, and tax credits available to support solar development on these degraded lands. And then workshop 3 will be focused on community solar, both the community solar model and opportunities for community ownership of solar on degraded lands. Many of you filled out a pre-workshop survey, and thank you for your input because that will help us develop content that will either fit into workshop 2 or 3 or maybe lead to a workshop 4. So thank you for that, and look for a post-survey workshop where you continue to add your input. So on to today's agenda in the next slide. We are going to begin with Brian Ross from GPI setting the stage and really talking about why there's so much focus on solar and renewable energy deployment at GPI. Then we're going to hear from Amanda Pankau at Prairie Rivers and Jacob Fink from Illinois EPA, who are going to introduce us to the different types of degraded lands and the regulatory authority over those lands and the reclamation and remediation of those lands. And then we're going to hear from the Nature Conservancy. We've got Nels Johnson and Jeff Walk will be talking to us about the opportunity for low impact solar siting on these lands, as well as the technical solar capacity in Illinois for this development. And then we have 10 minutes at the end set aside for discussion. So with that, I will pass things over to my colleague, Brian Ross, to kick us off. Thanks everyone for being here. Quick note, feel free to have your camera on or off. If you have questions, please use the chat in the discussion session. Feel free to come on camera or raise your hand using the raise hand function.
All right, thanks, Val. This is a really exciting opportunity and a lot of great discussion we hope to have here, and to launch the discussion for future meetings. We do hope to kind of that this will discussions will extend beyond just our workshop series here, and maybe we can get Actually, some over this series, some discussions going about specific projects that people are interested in. And if you are interested in kind of convening some of those, be sure to contact us. We're happy to try to kind of do some of that facilitation and make sure those happens and we actually get some projects. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the context we're in Illinois and the Midwest, and actually nationally to some extent. The solar market, as many people on this call are already very, very well aware, is rapidly expanding nationally, and Illinois is actually one of the center points for that rapid expansion. The market for solar in Illinois is very remarkable. We have here just a snapshot of the solar potential as calculated by the National Renewable Energy Lab on a county by county basis for large scale solar development in Illinois. And if you look at the current number of projects that are proposed in the state of Illinois, there's about 43 gigawatts worth of projects that are in the transmission, in the line for transmission access. This is a remarkable amount of capacity, and a lot of these projects that are in the queue right now are probably not going to end up being built for a variety of reasons. There's a whole set of characteristics including the cost of transmission access that will diminish that number, but it is a very good indication of the market. There, 43 gigawatts worth of solar is there because the developers think that they can sell it to somebody. The demand for solar has been increasing dramatically. Large scale solar is perhaps the lowest, least expensive means of generating electricity in the nation, and between wind and solar, those are the two least expensive in Illinois on a cost per kilowatt hour basis. When something is inexpensive, people want more of it, in addition to the fact that it is a clean energy source. But because of the low costs that we're seeing now and the tax incentives, the demand for solar generation dramatically outstrips supply, which is why we're seeing such a remarkable amount of proposals, of development proposals in the state of Illinois. The 43 gigawatts is actually roughly approximate to the total summertime demand for electricity in the state of Illinois from all sources. So it is just to put some context on it, since many people don't know what 43 gigawatts means. If you looked at the total amount of demand in the entire state at the peak months in summertime, it is about 45 gigawatts. So, but what does this mean, 43 gigawatts? If we hypothetically actually developed all of that capacity that's currently asking for transmission access, all the large scale projects that are currently on the table, it would require about 340,000 acres of land, which is a lot of land. It is actually less than 1% of the land mass of Illinois, but 1% is a big thing, a big change across the state. And this is kind of what communities are wrestling with now as they move forward. Next slide. There's also, in addition to the market forces that we're seeing around solar, there's a whole lot of policy, both at the state and the federal level. And some of the speakers are going to talk a little bit more about this. But we have the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA, which has set a 40% renewable energy goal for the state by 2030 and 100% clean energy goal by 2050. So there's a lot of policies pushing this forward to actually see this development occur and to continue the market that we're seeing now in the state. The 2030 goals, some people have estimated that the 40% by 2030 would require about 17 gigawatts of solar, to use more of those gigawatt numbers. That does include both large scale and small scale development. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the current amount of solar, or at least last year, the current amount of solar deployed in Illinois was about 2.3 gigawatts. So you can see that just the 2030 goals under CEJA would require an 8-fold increase, or 7-fold increase actually, in the total amount of solar that is currently deployed, which is one reason why we're seeing a lot of that development in being supported by state incentives and also by federal incentives, which are also continuing to accelerate deployment. So the question that we have today, and a lot of communities are wrestling with, are where is the solar development going to occur, and what choices do communities have about how this market is moving forward? Okay, next slide. A lot of what we're dealing with now in Illinois is the land use and economic trade-offs of solar development versus other kinds of development and versus existing land uses. There are a lot of conflicts that have been raised. Some of them are perceived and some of them are real, but nevertheless, the things that we hear about are the concerns about agricultural lands being taken out of production, the economics of agriculture at the local scale when when people who are renting are having to compete with solar in terms of competition on the solar development, impacts to natural resources and ecosystem functions as solar development increasingly becomes more than just a token in the landscape. It actually starts to kind of move toward that 1% of total land, and the opportunity costs where solar is competing with other forms of development, which we particularly see in places in northern Illinois where there are land pressures of a variety of types that solar is also competing with. There's different ways that we can mitigate those perceived and real impacts, including making sure we're siting things to avoid kind of high value agricultural lands or natural resource lands or areas with high importance to community character. We can do site design that incorporates a lot of co-benefits that helps mitigate the impacts, land use impacts and economic impacts, including things called ecovoltaics, which is where you're incorporating natural resource functions into the solar design itself, which can actually help restore ecosystem functions that have been lost, or agrivoltaics, which is the incorporation of agricultural land uses into the solar design as well. But the one we're going to talk about today is the prioritization of low impact and low conflict siting opportunities and how that might work in Illinois. Illinois is as Val kind of mentioned earlier, kind of a poster child with the large scale opportunities to do solar on former mine lands. That is something that is somewhat unique in the state. So that's just kind of setting the stage for kind of what my colleagues here are going to present in much more detail. So now I'll pass it on to, I think Amanda's going next. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Yep.
All right, next up we have Amanda Pankau from the Prairie Rivers Network. Amanda, we'll give you a sec to share your screen. Looks like it's starting.
All right.
Perfect.
Take it away. Thanks, Val and Brian. My name is Amanda Pankau, and I'm the Director of Energy and Community Resiliency at Prairie Rivers Network. I've worked on issues related to coal mining in Illinois for over 15 years. And today at Prairie Rivers Network, I work with advocates, leaders, and communities to realize the benefits of renewable energy and address the costs of non-renewable sources like coal. I want to also thank my coworker, Randa Watts, who's on today's call, for helping me with preparing today's presentation. Before coming to Prairie Rivers Network, Randa worked at the Quincy, Illinois landfill and Superfund site. So my task today is to give you an introduction to degraded and contaminated lands. We'll answer some questions like, what are different types of degraded lands and what impacts do they have on people and the environment in Illinois? Where are they located in Illinois? What laws and agencies are in charge of cleaning them up? And finally, how are they cleaned up? And we're going to do all that in 10 minutes. So let's take a quick glance at some of the types of degraded lands and the terms used to describe them. So sometimes we're talking about very specific activities that occurred on a property, like coal mining or a landfill. So coal mine lands are obviously properties where the extraction of coal occurred, and they may or may not be cleaned up or reclaimed, depending on when that mining occurred. Landfill means a facility where waste is placed and accumulated over time for disposal. We have non-hazardous and hazardous waste landfills, and again, depending on when they occurred, they may be in different stages of remediation. We also have more general terms like brownfields to describe degraded lands. Brownfield is used to describe any area that had a past activity that left behind the presence or the potential presence of pollution that is now limiting future reuse or redevelopment. So brownfields might include landfills or mine lands, manufacturing sites, industrial facilities. And then finally, Superfund sites are sites with hazardous substances that are being cleaned up under a very specific federal program and law that is meant for the nation's worst sites. Superfund sites may also have many different types of past uses. Degraded lands cause air and water, land contamination. They pose serious safety hazards, and they harm the health and economic well-being of nearby communities. They limit biodiversity and wildlife use, and they release emissions that contribute to climate change. These lands and their impacts have disproportionately harmed low-income communities and communities of color across the United States and in Illinois. The cleanup and reuse of these sites is incredibly important work. We're going to take a closer look at some of those types of degraded lands I mentioned. Over a century of coal mining occurred in Illinois before the passage of any laws to regulate the operation or the cleanup of the industry. In response to the growing environmental problems, health and safety risk, Congress passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977. SMCRA, as we call this law, created two programs. One, to regulate the operation and reclamation of new and active post-law coal mines, so anything after 1977. The other part of the law dealt with lands that were mined and abandoned prior to the passage of the law. These unreclaimed sites prior to 1907 were defined legally as abandoned mine lands. We call them pre-law lands or AML lands. SMCRA is a federal law in the Office of Surface Mining, Control and Reclamation and Enforcement within the Department of Interior is the federal agency responsible. SMCRA allows for states to establish their own laws and regulatory programs to manage coal mining and reclamation. And in Illinois, we have done that, and our Illinois Department of Natural Resources Office of Mines and Minerals is the regulatory authority in charge of reclaiming both pre- and post-law mine lands. I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about mine lands because we're going to hear from IEPA later with more details on brownfields and landfills. I will touch on those too, though. So taking a closer look at the two reclamation programs in Illinois for mine lands, our Abandoned Mine Land Reclamation Division is in charge of cleaning up these sites that were mined before 1977 SMCRA law. Many of these are still unreclaimed today. They're reclaimed with money from an AML reclamation fund that is paid for by a tax on coal, as well as new money from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And even when these sites are privately owned, IDNR is in charge of designing reclamation projects and contracting the reclamation work with independent contractors. Conversely, the Land Reclamation Division at IDNR is in charge of all mines after 1977. These are the mines that required a permit and reclamation plan after SMCRA was passed. Mining companies have to pay for and perform the reclamation shortly after mining occurs. They must meet certain post-mining land use standards, and bonds from the company provide a financial guarantee for reclamation. The plans for reclamation and these financial guarantees don't always work out, and we do have unreclaimed modern mines in Illinois as well. Coal has been mined in 76 of Illinois' 102 counties, and IDNR does maintain a mine permit viewer map that allows you to view the location of both post-law and pre-law mines and get information about their reclamation status. And we'll hear a lot more about this from TNC later. While we're on the topic of coal, I did want to mention the cleanup and potential reuse of former coal power plant sites. Many of our coal plants in Illinois have closed over the last decade. There really are no standardized methods or permitted program for the cleanup of the non-coal ash facilities at these sites. Coal ash cleanup is guided by a 2019 law, the Coal Ash Pollution Prevention Act, and closure plans for coal ash are approved by the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. Experts that we work with in Illinois do have concerns about development on top of coal ash. However, development could safely occur on non-coal ash areas or in cases where coal ash is removed during the cleanup process. Moving on to landfills, which again, I'll just touch briefly on landfills and brownfields because we'll hear more from Jacob Fink with IEPA. But the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, 1976, we've got a lot of great acronyms here. This one is RCRA, is our nation's primary law governing the disposal of non-hazardous and hazardous waste. In Illinois, landfills are permitted and the cleanup and closure of the landfill is regulated by IEPA's Bureau of Land. And like abandoned mine lands, we have old landfills in Illinois that were in use before regulations existed, and they're not subject to the same permitting and post-closure care requirements as permitted landfills. Permitted landfills are subject to state and federal law and are in various stages of use and cleanup across the state. IEPA does maintain an interactive map of where landfills are located in Illinois. And on my slides here, I have hyperlinks to all of these mapping software. So when we share our slides after today, folks can use this presentation to get to all those maps. So we already talked about how brownfield is can be a very broad term to describe sites that had various past uses. It's often a generic term to describe any site where the future reuse is limited. But brownfield is also a term that's defined under law to describe sites that are assessed and cleaned up under state and federal programs. Brownfield cleanup began with the US EPA in the mid-1990s, so really not that long ago. US EPA's practices and policies were then codified into law with the 2002 Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act. Since that time, EPA's Brownfields program has continued to work with states and communities on cleaning up these sites. Some of the brownfield programming and funding flows from the federal US EPA. Illinois' EPA does have a remedial project management section that manages brownfield programs and technical support in Illinois. And once again, we're going to hear more about that from Jacob. There is an estimate of 450,000 brownfields in the United States that the US EPA has stated. Unfortunately, they are very common and it's hard to know the exact number and location of sites. So there's really no statewide mapping, but there are efforts through brownfield funding to do local inventories, and we've seen some regional mapping in Illinois. Finally, Superfund is a word to describe the sites that are dealt with under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, another acronym, CERCLA. This passed in 1980, and it allows the US EPA to clean up the nation's worst hazardous waste sites, and when possible, force the parties responsible to clean them up. Superfund gets its name from the fund of money that was created to pay for the cleanup, which came from a chemical tax. That collection of that tax actually expired in 1995, but was reauthorized with the bipartisan infrastructure law. So this program is administered by US EPA, again, in cooperation with state governments, and Illinois' Bureau of Land at IEPA Federal Site Remediation Section is in charge. The Superfund is based on this national priorities list, which is the list of the worst sites in the nation. And they do maintain a map for those, and we have 45 national priority list sites in Illinois. So moving on to a bit about site cleanup with the time we have today. So we often hear this referred to as remediation or reclamation, restoration, and how much cleanup is needed is obviously going to depend on the specific contaminants at the site and how the site is going to be reused. I've mentioned that with some sites like permitted landfills or permitted coal mines, there are very specific requirements and plans for cleanup. And so the following are just some of the commonly used methods for cleaning up brownfields and other contaminated lands. This includes excavating and removing contaminants at the site and properly disposing of them in new permitted facilities, the addition of chemicals to break down or bind contaminants, and some of this type of treatment has to be ongoing and actively maintained. For coal ash and landfills, you'll often hear people talk about capping, which means adding a barrier between the contaminants and the surface with artificial material or soil. Bioremediation refers to the process when we use a biological system like bacteria bacteria or plants to remove environmental pollutants. And finally, regrading, adding clean fill and topsoil, and revegetating are very common methods used in cleaning up sites. So I was asked to touch a bit today on potential future uses of remediated sites in addition to solar development. And so this is, of course, dependent on the type of contaminants present, the extent to which the site can be remediated, and the pollution cleaned up. Some sites will continue to have problems despite our best efforts. So the uses of the land can range broadly from residential to green space to commercial to industrial projects. And many of us can probably think of examples of this in our own communities or nearby. There's just really countless examples. And we're not going into detail today on funding or incentives, but I did want to share and really celebrate the fact that thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have more funding than ever to clean up coal mines, Superfund sites, brownfields in Illinois and across the country. And in fact, just yesterday, Randa and I joined federal, state, and community leaders in Springfield, where the Department of Interior just announced an additional $75 million for abandoned mine land reclamation in Illinois. And we're projected to receive this level of funding every year for a 15-year period because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So the money for pollution cleanup in Illinois and across the nation is being called a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And I know at Prairie Rivers Network, we're really excited to see how these sites can be reclaimed and become assets for some of the communities that need them the most. So I just wanted to thank GPI, TNC, and everyone on today's call for interest in helping do that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amanda, for that comprehensive overview. Next up, we will hear from Jacob Fink at IEPA, who will talk us through that agency's role in reclamation of brownfields and landfills. Just to note, everyone, we will be sharing slides in the recording after today's event.
Hi, I'm Jacob Fink with Illinois EPA's Brownfield program. I've been with Illinois EPA for about 6 years now. Started out in Office of Site Evaluation, where we go and it's actually hands-on sampling there. So I've got some experience with some of these sites, actually physically going and doing some of the work. So it's pretty interesting work. Next slide, please. So at Illinois EPA, we kind of have two resources in our toolbox for advancing brownfield sites. One of them is targeted brownfield assessments. We normally do phase 1 and phase 2 activities, which phase 1 is normally just a paper trail for the different sites. And it'll kind of give a brief overview of what's happened on the site. And it also gives the prospective purchaser CERCLA liability coverage. So you won't be liable for the existing contamination on site after you purchase the site. And these targeted brownfield assessments are available for free to municipalities and nonprofits. There is a way for for-profit entities, if they're interested in that kind of stuff, pairing with nonprofits. It gets a little more complicated that way, but there is a way to do that. But the phase 1 gives you liability coverage for CERCLA, and the phase 2 activities are normally they go back and actually investigate. They call them RECs, recognized environmental concerns. So you'll actually go back and you'll sample these areas that have environmental concerns, and these happen on all these different sites that they were talking about, from old industrial sites to just an abandoned corner gas station, or maybe some old pharmacy. There's a ton of different sites out there that qualify for these targeted brownfield assessments. Next slide, please. So it begins with an application and a letter. It's all available on our website. And we normally have 4 to 8 sites a year. But as they were alluding to before, the BIL funding has allowed us to kind of ramp up what we're doing, and we're taking more sites than that this year. So it's kind of an unprecedented time for that, and it's really great for our program because we can get more sites through and hopefully a little bit closer to getting cleaned up. Next slide. This is just kind of a cool picture of what it used to look like taking soil borings with an old auger. Next slide. So our sampling equipment nowadays is we have 2 geoprobes at Illinois EPA, 7822DT and a 6011. We also have ground penetrating radar for identifying utilities on site or also anywhere around the site. An EM61, which detects ferrous and non-ferrous metals underground. So if there was any sort of buried drums on your site or potentially an underground storage tank for fuels or heating oil. And then we also have an XRF, which is an X-ray fluorescence machine, and it gives you instant readouts of the different metals that are found, that can be found as contamination on sites. And it gives you, it's normally used as more of a screening tool. Next slide, please. This is our 7822DT. We do subsurface sampling. Next slide. So as you can see there, we can get up real close to the buildings and potentially vapor intrusion, or that's normally seen at dry cleaners and stuff like that. Next slide. This is an 8-inch auger, which is what's used for groundwater monitoring well installation. And that's quite a timely process, but we have the capability of installing monitoring wells. Next slide. And these are what the cores look like that we bring up. They come up in 4-foot sections, and then we screen them with either a PPB ray, which detects volatile organic compounds, and we also screen them with our XRF machine for metals. So we'll screen those and kind of decide where to take the sample at based on those criteria. Next slide, please. This is our smaller 6011 DT. It's can fit into confined spaces, into smaller inside of buildings, at least with a 48-inch wide opening. It does almost everything that the larger probe does, except for installing monitoring wells. Next slide, please. And there you can kind of see its narrow footprint, and that it's able to fit into these tighter spaces. Next slide. This is our GPR, a ground penetrating radar. We can find anomalies underneath the surface, detect different utilities. This is also a really great tool for finding disturbed soil. So say you have an underground storage tank that's already been removed many years ago and we're not quite sure where it's at. We can utilize this to figure out where that's at and take the samples there, and also figure out exactly where the edges of the excavation were. Next slide, please. Here's our EM61 metal detector. It can detect drums, underground storage tanks, utilities, any buried metal, ferrous or non-ferrous. We can create maps from it. It's linked to GPS. Next slide. This is an example of a map that we can create. You can see there it sees the manholes, and then over on the right-hand side there, you can kind of see what it looks like whenever it really detects a very large metallic object underground. Next slide, please. This is our XRF. Said it detects heavy metals. Very portable, very easy to do. And you can screen a whole site, and most sites can be done in a day. Excuse me. Screening with the XRF and make quick decisions for that. Next slide, please. Here's kind of an example of how we use the XRF data to kind of determine the extent of contamination. You can do it at different strata, surface 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, and determine how deep the contamination is and also where it's located at. Next slide. Through the targeted brownfield assessments, we also offer the analytical services for free. We use either our own Illinois EPA lab or the state contract lab. And we also have the ability to contract out if we need to do test pits or dig up some underground, if our findings indicate there's something underground, we have that ability. And all of our staff's 40-hour trained. Next slide, please. The application for these targeted brownfield assessments is on Illinois EPA's website. You can find it there. Is it a real property? That's kind of our a catchphrase there, but we just want to make sure that it is owned, that it has an owner that is willing to provide access. We look for past investigations. That's some information that's needed to determine the eligibility, property size, location, and then past uses to determine where our sampling takes place and what the samples get analyzed for. Next slide, please. We'll provide you with a report, engage with the community, and we'll try to get the municipality or nonprofit through a phase 1, phase 2, and ideally with all of the data needed to get you a remedial action plan. They call them RAPs. There's a ton of acronyms within government organizations, as you all probably know, and I'm going to try my best not to use the acronyms, but remedial action plans, and that's needed to gain. I mean, that's one of the steps to gain your no further remediation letter once you enroll in the site remediation program. We always encourage all of our municipalities and nonprofits to retain an environmental consultant, especially once they have all this data in hand. And that's kind of the next step to getting your site cleaned up and ready for redevelopment, is to enroll in this site remediation program. Next slide, please. So this is a little more information on the site remediation program. It's a voluntary cleanup. There has to be a remedial applicant. They don't have to be the property owner. So like a nonprofit can come in and serve as the remedial applicant. And you guys, the remedial applicant gets to choose what constitutes remediation of the site. So you can, the next slide, please. You can choose a comprehensive or a focused NFR. The comprehensive, as it sounds like, it includes all of our tiered approach to corrective action. tier 1 numbers. So that sounds really complicated, but basically it's just a set of health-based risk objectives, and they can choose whether they do a comprehensive or a focused NFR for certain constituents of concern. The types of conditions found on the NFR letter may be construction worker caution, engineering controls, institutional controls. So engineering controls would be something like a slab, a concrete slab over some contaminated soil, or maybe a geotextile barrier. Institutional controls may be that there's no basements allowed to be poured on that, or that it may no longer be suitable for actual houses to be built on it. It's only a commercial property. Those are the kind of institutional controls there. Next slide, please. And as I alluded to earlier, the tiered approach to corrective action. They have residential, industrial, commercial, and construction worker tiers, basically. And it's tier 1, tier 2. And then there's groundwater classifications, class 1 and class 2. There's routes of exposure, soil ingestion, outdoor inhalation, indoor inhalation, and migration to groundwater and groundwater ingestion. All of those kind of make up the decision on how much gets cleaned up and what cleanup objectives you'll have. And all those are once you get enrolled in the SRP program, your SRP consultant and you will kind of hash those things out. Next slide, please. So solar on landfills. The Bureau of Land permit section regulates all those landfills that are permitted. So if it's an active landfill, they can't have solar panels. A landfill must be in post-closure care or have completed post-closure care. And normally I think it's at least a 30-year post-closure care. But I can kind of facilitate the developer working with our Bureau of Land Permit section. And you have to submit kind of a permit change request. And that's kind of something that gets worked out there. And I don't think it's a too stringent process, but you have to show exactly what's going to be taking place on the landfill, and also that the cap will remain intact, or that 2 to 3 foot, I think it's normally, there's 3 to 4 foot clean cap, normally of clay, remains undisturbed. Next slide, please. So Illinois EPA's Brownfields future, we are in a kind of a transition period right now, because our current cooperative agreement with Illinois or with US EPA is ending, and we're starting our new cooperative agreement. So we're pursuing additional funding for the revolving loan fund. And so we'll be able to take new applications for that beginning in October of this year, pursuant to us getting the funding, but I believe we have a very good chance of that. And the BIL funding impacts. We have additional capacity for our targeted brownfield assessments, and also more funding opportunities are available than ever. It's pretty crazy just how much is out there right now to be had. There's 104K grants that are issued by US EPA that can get you after Illinois EPA kind of helps you get to that cleanup stage. Those 104K grants, you can apply to those, and that can help get your site fully cleaned up. And it's a great opportunity. Next slide, please. Here's some contacts for the site remediation program, and also my contact there. And we'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. I am sure folks have questions, so I would encourage you to use the chat for your questions. We will try to answer them live, in real time via the chat function. We also have the discussion session at the end, but your questions could also be informative for future workshops. I want to keep pushing us right along since we do have a packed agenda. So I'm now going to turn things over to Nels Johnson at the Nature Conservancy, who's going to talk to us about the solar opportunity on degraded lands based on their mining the sun analysis.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Val.
Thank
And I just want to thank Brian and Sue and the Great Plains Institute for organizing this workshop series. It's really timely. I'm going to kind of share with you some experience we've had working on these issues for the last 5 years. But let me first just briefly introduce myself. I'm Nels Johnson. I've been with the Nature Conservancy in a variety of different roles, but the most exciting work that I've been doing in many respects has been what I've been doing for the last 8 or 10 years, which is working on how we accelerate clean energy development across the United States. And most importantly, how do we do it in ways that avoid impacts to nature? That's why the Nature Conservancy is so engaged on this topic, and also local communities. How do we make these massive investments in new infrastructure work for climate, for conservation, and for local communities? So as I mentioned, we've been working on mining the sun for about 5 years. It's really a really growing field of interest. And I'll explain a little bit of that to you in just a few minutes. What I'm going to be sharing is relatively high level. So we've heard a lot about really great stuff about the regulatory context in Illinois. What are some of the prevailing laws, both at the federal level and translated to the state level? And what are the things you can do under those legal regimes to redevelop these sites? So I'm going to provide kind of more of a context of why should we think about doing all this work? What's the reason? What's the opportunity that we're looking at? So next slide. So we started this work 5 years ago, really in 2 different places. I had colleagues in West Virginia who were looking at former large, what were called mountaintop removal mines that had been no longer in production and were very flat. Many jobs had disappeared. There's no tax revenue happening. And at the same time, I was working with colleagues in Nevada, and they were looking at these huge mine sites that were nearby where there were massive solar projects going in, converting desert habitat that was important for desert tortoise and other rare species in the Mojave. And they were saying, well, why don't we think about minelands as an opportunity for siting these? And so we brought those 2 ideas together and created this initiative called Mining the Sun. We've now worked in 8 states in depth across the country, including Illinois. You're going to hear from my colleague, Jeff Walk, who's the Director of Conservation in Illinois towards the end of this session, about kind of the context, more specifically in Illinois. But in any case, we think this approach can generate a lot of benefits because it can help remediate lands that have become liabilities in local communities. It can generate jobs and revenue if we integrate it into economic development strategies. And of course, we can avoid impacts to natural systems and to prime agricultural lands. Next. So why do these lands matter? So just to kind of build on what Brian had talked about earlier, there is just a massive investment, a massive amount of demand that is building for new clean energy resources. Over the next 3 decades, between now and mid-century, we are going to see an area the size of Texas perhaps needed to accommodate all the solar, all the wind projects, transmission lines, and other clean energy technologies in order to meet our energy needs by mid-century and have what we call net zero carbon dioxide emissions. As one can imagine, with that amount of land required to accommodate all this infrastructure, the potential for conflicts over the land is tremendous in terms of land use for agriculture, for residential housing, for open space, and of course, from our perspective, also natural habitats and wildlife. At the same time, we have a huge backlog of unrestored sites that have been brownfields, and we use the word collectively for landfills, former industrial lands, the surplus sites or the Superfund sites. We just are calling them all brownfields. We're not differentiating at this high level of discussion. Once you get into the details of how you might go about putting solar on those sites, then you have to get into the details of that. And of course, if we repurpose, recycle these lands, so to speak, for solar, we can generate benefits that are beyond just the solar generation itself. One of the reasons why we think minelands and brownfields are good sites is they have some characteristics that make them fairly good sites. And I'll get into some of the reasons why it's hard to exploit all these good things in a moment. But just to start with, we often have workers and equipment nearby in communities near minelands and brownfields that might be appropriate for their redevelopment and for eventually introducing new infrastructure. We often have nearby utilities, and we have transmission lines off into these sites because they required lots of power in their former use. We have road access typically. They're often flat and cleared, although not always. And so those are some of the reasons why we think these lands are good candidates for a lower impact way to deploy clean energy. Next. So just to step back even a little further, and I think Brian touched on this just a little bit, but solar does have impacts. I mean, depending on where it goes, it can have a variety of different kinds of impacts. And so these are just some of the impacts that we're seeing with solar. Obviously, it can convert habitat. When you're in a forest environment, like the picture you see of a project here in Pennsylvania, that involved clearing forest, and then you lose the natural carbon. And so that project has what we call a carbon debt because it's cleared carbon to put a carbon saving technology. Ultimately, it'll still save carbon, but not as much as it would have. It can fragment the habitat, which means that it's harder for animals to move around. It can convert agricultural habitat, and I know in Illinois and other states, there are concerns about prime farmland being converted to solar. There are a variety of other kind of natural effects that can happen. I won't go into detail. And of course, it can have impacts on local community, the adjacency to residences and schools. We can see impacts to cultural and historic sites. It can lower property values, or at least there's a perception it can lower property values, although the research is kind of mixed on that. And then there's just the kind of more intangible impact to character of the landscape and the community that people live in. And, it's a change. It looks different when you have large renewable energy facilities in a community. Next. So as I was mentioning, there's this large amount of area that's going to be required to accommodate all the clean energy we're going to need over the next several decades. And location. Where you put things makes a difference in terms of what kinds of impacts might occur. And so I've just listed on the left kind of the kinds of areas that are particularly impacted if you're putting wind or solar or really any infrastructure, natural habitats, wildlife corridors. In the case of hydro, unfragmented rivers that are not currently dammed. And then human uses as well, prime agricultural lands, and of course, valued areas for social and cultural features. So where are the places that don't have those impacts or have less potential for those impacts? There's almost kind of a hierarchy that you can think of. The first is to start with there's efficiency and demand response. So that's maybe the first place we can make the most gains in terms of reducing carbon emissions and not having to use land and potentially create impacts. We have lots of rooftops, so distributed solar on both residential and commercial and industrial rooftops, warehouses. That's an option. Parking lots, you're starting to see that in the Southwest and the Southeast, for example. You're starting to see parking lots of solar. And then, of course, then we get to former mines and industrial lands. We get to other places that are interesting as well. I won't go into the details. What I'll just point out is transportation corridors, highways and railroads. That's really starting to get looked at now for transmission. And actually the Great Plains Institute and the Next Gen Highways Group, the Great Plains Institute is working with, is doing some really great work on that. And we're really excited about some of those possibilities. Next. So just to set the stage, let's just kind of step back from Illinois and just talk about how big is this opportunity nationwide. As we heard earlier, there have been some new policy changes at the federal level. We have the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, it included a 10% production tax credit for renewable energy on clean energy, actually more than just renewable energy, but clean energy in energy communities, which were defined in kind of a complex way, but basically they're communities that had former fossil fuel extraction or energy generation. And it also included communities with brownfields. And so when you look at the census tracts, that's how the Inflation Reduction Act defined the kind of the boundaries of these communities. Turns out 64 million people live in those places. And so that's just a way of saying that there are a lot of people who live in communities where these kinds of projects can generate benefits. We took a narrower look at those communities to actually kind of isolate the communities that are most related to former coal and oil and gas uses, and we find that there are about 23 million people living in those communities. One thing that is interesting to note is that between now and 2050, over a third of all clean energy projects we've projected, and others have too, will be going into these energy communities, these communities of 23 million people, including, of course, quite a few communities in Illinois. Even though they only account for 7% of the population. So there's going to be a disproportionate amount of clean energy coming to these communities. And we think to make those investments and make those projects work best for these communities, why don't we really focus on the minelands and brownfields that are located there? So next. So we think minelands and brownfields is a win-win solution, as I said earlier at the beginning. We think of these projects as providing an opportunity to generate climate benefits, conservation benefits, and community benefits, with something we call the 3C approach. It's kind of a way of trying to say, let's not just worry about one of those C's. Let's think about how we can develop these projects in ways in which we can generate benefits across all three of these C's. And I was amused to hear Brian talk about ecovoltaics. That's a new one for me, but clearly that is one that can generate some additional benefits here. And I'm interested in hearing more about that. Next. So when we talk about these brownfield and mineland sites, one thing that we think is exciting is to think of them as not just being available for solar. That's typically what we think of, but can we even think beyond that? Can we think of these becoming new energy hubs? Can we co-locate technologies here? So, it's a little early to say how, for example, the hydrogen economy is going to evolve in the United States, but is there an opportunity for hydrogen production to be linked to solar production at these sites? Is there an opportunity to do storage at these sites? And one thing that's really exciting is that the Department of Energy, in its Clean Energy and Minelands Demonstration Program, which is created under the Infrastructure Act, puts aside $500 million to create 5 really large-scale demonstration projects of clean energy and minelands. Some of those projects will be a combination of technologies, and we think that's really exciting. And that set of grants is going to be announced, we think, in April, and it'll be really exciting to see what projects. And just to illustrate how big the interest is, when they announced this grant program last spring, they got 99 applications from across the United States, almost 30 states applications came from. They're handing out, $500 million, but the amount of capital that was being committed to from applicants to co-develop those projects with private capital was $27 billion. So there's a huge amount of interest in this, and we think these incentives are really on the verge of really, we hope, unlocking demand for clean energy on mineland and brownfield sites. Next. So if these sites are so good, why haven't we seen more? We have an inventory from the EPA's repowering program, which has been kind of focusing on this topic now for over a decade. They have about 450 projects that they've inventoried, but most of them are very small. They're just a few megawatts. Most of them are on landfills, some are on brownfields, and virtually none are on minelands. And there's a reason for that. We interviewed developers across the country to kind of get their take on why these properties, what it would take for them to be more interested, or what are the challenges they're facing in order of putting solar or other clean energy technologies on these sites. And here's a list. I won't go into all of them, but some of them we've already heard about, but it's gaining site control. What about contamination? Are you liable for the contamination that exists with the site? What about permitting delays? If you run into some unexpected contaminant or something that crops up after you've committed to working on the site, what does that do to permitting? What about environmental assessments? I mean, how much does that cost? How many of those are you going to have to do? And then what remediation might be required? There are geotechnical factors. I mean, these lands often have disturbed soils and subsurfaces. And so what does that mean in terms of stability for putting infrastructure? So those are just some of the kinds of challenges that we're facing in terms of developing these sites. And that's why it was so great to hear Amanda and the EPA in Illinois talk about these possibilities. So next. So one thing everyone wants to know is, well, how much does it cost to develop these sites? And we commissioned ICF, which is a major consulting firm that works with renewable energy companies around the world. And we commissioned them to do a study comparing solar costs in greenfield versus brownfields. And they were able to get limited data because there just isn't that much experience out there. But the data they did get enabled us to kind of get some approximation of what the difference in cost is between greenfields and brownfields. And here we've broken down what the cost categories are, and then we've categorized them by whether they're the same relatively, whether they're more expensive, the same, or even less expensive. And so you can kind of see here just how we came up with this characterization, but there are certainly things that are more expensive. Site preparation, engineering, and construction and permitting are generally more expensive. What is more or less the same is operations and maintenance. Once you get a project built, the interconnection cost to actually get it online. And total capital expenditure costs, we put as the same, even though it's about 10% more, because those tax credits I was just talking about from the IRA can offset that. And so that makes it more or less the same. What's less expensive, typically these sites, is that the land is much cheaper because it has these challenges, right? It's contaminated, or it's a former mineland, and it's not very ready for development for more commercial uses. So that means it can be available fairly inexpensively compared to greenfield sites. Next. And this is just a chart that kind of breaks down that cost differential. And so on the left, you can see a greenfield site. On the right, you can see a brownfield site. It is about 10 to 15% more expensive on average. And then we showed the IRA tax credits in that stippled color at the top. And so the greenfield site, for example, might qualify for a 10% tax credit because it's in a poor community, low-income community. It might score an additional 10% tax credit because it's on a reservation with tribal nations. So that applies to any project as long as it's in those communities. But what you get if you're on a project that's a mineland or a brownfield in one of those energy communities, you get a 10% tax credit, which can help to close that gap between a greenfield and a brownfield project. On average, it looks like we can get close to 10% of the cost reduced, and that's kind of close to the average that ICF is estimating that is 10 to 15% typically. We know that cost difference ranges dramatically with the individual characteristics of the site. So some sites might be less expensive less costly to develop than others more costly, but they found with the limited projects they could look at 10 to 15% on average. Next. Centering the community is really important, we think. The communities near minelands and brownfields, of course, have had to look for ways to revitalize and bring lands that are no longer producing jobs or revenues back to life. They may have suffered the consequences of that contamination or air pollution, water pollution that may have been going on there for many years. And we think they really should be at the center of planning and development of these projects, helping figure out what they look like and how they can benefit the community, as well as provide energy that goes onto the grid to benefit all the rest of us. We've developed kind of a set of what we think are best practices, and I think there's growing attention to the importance of making sure that communities benefit from these clean energy investments. We've been seeing kind of some growing resistance in communities across the country to clean energy projects in their neighborhood, and there are some good reasons for that. And we think one way to counter that is to make sure that they are engaged early and often in developing these projects and deriving real clear, tangible benefits from them. I won't go into the specific practices. You can go to our website and get into some of the details of this when our Mining the Sun report goes live in April. And I'll give you a link for that in a moment. So just to say, this is really an important thing that we think is really exciting. And that's why I think it's so interesting that this meeting is really pulling in communities from Illinois to really start thinking about this opportunity. Next. I'm just going to close with a few thoughts about policy. I'm not going to dwell on this because we already heard about this, but when we look across the country and when EPA has actually inventoried kind of state policies that exist to facilitate clean energy on minelands and brownfields across the country, they only found 11 states that have explicit policies that are either incentives or regulatory or permitting programs that are designed to facilitate this kind of development. And what's interesting is only 3 of them actually combine both incentives and permitting reforms, permitting, accelerated permitting, and those states are Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York. And when you look at where are these projects, an astounding 52% of them are in those three states. So that is just a really strong signal that incentives may not be enough in terms of just strictly financial incentives. What can really make a difference, it seems, is combining incentives with some accelerated permitting. And if you can do those two things, you're going to see a lot more interest in these kinds of projects. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nels, and thank you for that closing, bringing everything into perspective on how we can incentivize the redevelopment of these lands. We are going to turn to a quick poll before we continue actually with the Nature Conservancy's presentation, and then we've got 10 minutes at the end, hopefully still set aside for Q&A. So the question we have for you now, and it's a multiple choice, we'd really like to hear from you. What are some potential concerns you think your community might have over redevelopment of these lands with solar? We've had a little bit of a conversation in the chat about these concerns, and there was also some feedback on the pre-workshop survey that went out around concerns and challenges with reusing mined lands or previously contaminated land. So I do think we'll be either addressing those challenges and concerns and getting industry perspective on a future planned workshop, or perhaps adding a fourth workshop to talk about those potential concerns, challenges, and barriers. We'll give you just another 30 seconds to answer that poll if you haven't already. Coming in hot at over 75% of the respondents think a potential concern is the general lack of familiarity with the concept of reclamation and redevelopment. And as we saw in the chat, there are concerns and questions about recontamination. Visual impact still a concern, and coming in at 5%. Some of these lands are currently being used by the community in an informal way, perhaps as green space. Okay, I think we can close the polls. The results really haven't changed as I was reading your responses live. All right, I'll stop sharing that. Or Sue, do you stop sharing and share the results?
Yes. Sorry. All right.
Okay, thank you. So Jeff, Nels, we are handing it back to you and to Jeff for the last of the presentations around the technical solar capacity in Illinois for solar on minelands and brownfields.
Thank you, Val. And by the way, I just wanted to say, looking at this piece of equipment remediated a mineland site actually in Illinois, that picture Jacob shared with the GeoProbe 7822 DT, boy, does that look like fun to play with. But anyway, this is going to be just kind of an overview of what we found looking at the opportunities in Illinois. We've done this in about a dozen states now across the country. I will just say that Illinois provides maybe more potential than almost any other state we've looked at, both because of the policy environment, the market demand, and of course, the large areas of brownfields and former minelands that exist in the state. So it's actually a really great state, we think, for pursuing these opportunities. So next. So we created for those dozen or so states what we call opportunity maps, and we're now working, we hope, over the next year or two to expand this to be nationwide in coverage. EPA has done a fabulous job at inventorying brownfields and minelands across the US that are feasible from a technical point of view for clean energy development. They've looked specifically at sites that are good for solar, sites that are good for wind and geothermal and other technologies. We're focused on the solar side of it right here. What we found though, in talking to developers, is there are so many sites there and they're not really screened for the feasibility of developing them from an economic or market perspective. In other words, are they in a place that's close enough to transmission? Are they a large enough site? Many brownfield sites in the database that EPA has for all sites are relatively small. It's a former gas station. It's a former clean drying facilities, dry cleaners facility. Those just aren't very good for projects. So we decided to take a look at the same data, but using some filters on it to get a better sense of what's the real potential in the near term for development of these sites. So in Illinois, we use the same approach that we've used in all these states. And I'll just explain those methods a bit here, just so you understand where we come up with the numbers that Jeff is going to share with you in a couple of minutes. But so first of all, you've got to understand how far are you from a sufficient size transmission line to accommodate new energy coming on to the grid. And so what you see in green is kind of the corridors that are along transmission lines that are at least 165 kV and larger in Illinois. And we've got 10-mile wide corridors. I think they're 10-mile wide. I have to check on the actual width. But we used basically a distance that was recommended by talking to developers about the distance they want to be from transmission line and what's kind of their outer limit for being away from a power line. And then from that, then we looked at the database that EPA has for brownfields, and that's those brown circles. And we identified the ones that were within those green corridors that are at least 10 acres to any size larger than that. And then we actually categorize them. Sites that are 10 to 50 acres, we think are really good candidates for what we call community scale solar. That's relatively small projects that just serve a local community. And, we're seeing increased interest in community solar projects in different parts of the country, at least where the regulations allow for it. And so we've identified those sites. And then the larger brown circles are the larger brownfield sites that are 50 acres or larger and maybe capable of accommodating utility scale projects. And then we also looked at minelands. And so you can see it's a little harder to see because we actually have parcel data for these. And I'll just say that the data for the brownfields is not parcel data, it's point data. And you can find attributes, including acreage for those sites, but they're not mapped, as we heard earlier. They're not mapped in detail. The mineland sites are actually mapped, and USGS has collected the best data from state agencies. And so they have kind of been assembling a nationwide map of mineland sites. And those are the orange, that's the orange color you can see in this image. And that's an opportunity for mineland development. Again, those mineland sites are within those green corridors. Next. So I'm gonna just talk a little bit about where you can drill into this data and get more information about this kind of information that can be used for planning and development of clean energy projects on minelands and brownfields. So as I mentioned, we'll be releasing the Mining the Sun report in April. You can get to it at Mining the Sun at our website, nature.org. Two other great places, as I've mentioned, is EPA, the repowering program. It's just a wealth of data and information on just about every conceivable topic you can think of. So you can kind of see their overview and guide to all of their information in the first link there. The second link takes you straight to their repowering application, their mapper for finding these sites. Like I said, it enables you to see literally several 100,000 sites across the country. You have to kind of know what you're looking for when you go to their site, but if you know what you're looking for, lots of really great data there. And then there's another site that I became aware of in conversations with colleagues at the Department of Energy, and they have something called the Geospatial Mapping System. And you can see the link there for that resource. But it's kind of another interactive mapping system that it can enable anyone at any place to look at their opportunities for energy development and all the kinds of impacts that there might be in that place. And it's really an incredibly helpful tool if you're interested in using that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce or just turn it over to my colleague, Jeff Walk. Jeff is a great colleague of mine that I've worked with for years. He's been a key partner, and the Illinois program has been a key partner with us on the Mining the Sun program. And he's going to just share kind of a little bit more about the Illinois context and how we kind of see that at the Nature Conservancy. So Jeff?
All right, thanks, Nels. Yeah, so some things that came out of this, it's people don't necessarily always think about Illinois as a major coal state when compared to places like Wyoming and West Virginia, but it is a state with a massive amount of coal reserves, and at least in the past, that was a very large industry in the state, but it has contracted a lot over the last 50 years or so. I recently heard a statistic that 50 years ago in the 1970s, there were 1,500 active mines in the state, and it's now less than 24. In my hometown where I live now, it had a bit of a coal boom itself in the 1960s and 1970s, and the population has since dropped from about 4,000 residents to 1,200. So I think those types of economic and social impacts in small communities or across the state are not unusual, not necessarily explicitly tied to the drop-off in mining, but that has certainly been a factor affecting a lot of the downstate communities affected by this. So there are about 2,000 acres of former strip mines in the state. From the Mining the Sun analysis, we've identified about 140,000 that are technically suitable for solar development, including with that the brownfields. We have 180,000 acres that's potentially available for renewable energy development, which takes us more than halfway to that 340,000 acres that Brian highlighted up front that would be needed to accommodate the currently proposed solar capacity looking for transmission access in the state. And has come up, I think Illinois is perhaps in a class by itself in terms of the policy and enabling conditions for renewable energy build out, both with the tremendous amounts of federal funding that are sloshing around in the system from the bipartisan infrastructure bill and Inflation Reduction Act, but also within the Climate and Equitable Job Act of the state itself, setting that target of 40% clean energy by 2030. And next slide, please. So some things that we would specifically like to see happen here, while we appreciate the carve out in the CEJA bill requiring the Illinois Power Agency to award renewable energy credits for 3% for brownfield and solar projects. That is something that we think has the possibility to expand to further encourage the redevelopment of these sites. Related to the abandoned mine lands program and the new funding that's coming into that to help remediate some of these. I want to also acknowledge that some of these mine lands in a heavily converted state like Illinois are really important wildlife habitat and also recreation areas. Our largest state park in Illinois, Pyramid, just north of Carbondale, is on a reclaimed strip mine. So as I'm thinking about the AML in particular and some of my personal research doing on reclaimed mine lands, that pre-law areas that Amanda was focusing or mentioning earlier typically have a very choppy topography to them as they're and not much wildlife value. As those are reclaimed, I think we create an even better opportunity for renewable energy deployment that doesn't necessarily conflict with some of those ecosystem services that we might otherwise be concerned with. So very eager to help leverage that $75 million that's coming to the DNR for those types of projects. And then finally, just really need to work on building the awareness of the federal tax incentives that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act for renewable energy projects, especially in energy communities across the state. So we're excited to do this work and looking forward to continue the conversation in the following workshops. And I want to make sure I get this back to Val and leave some time for essential questions.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thank you, everyone who's presented. We are recording. We will be sharing recording and slides. We've just got about 5 minutes for discussion. Maybe, Sue, if you can move on to the next slide, and then I'll come back to the discussion. Hopefully this has been a good rapid fire introduction to what are these lands, which agencies have authority over their cleanup, what's the solar opportunity over these lands, and what's the impact of cleanup and solar redevelopment on energy transition communities, the environment, and of course, helping to meet state clean energy goals. If some of you have to jump off at the top of the hour, just want to say we have an additional discussion session slated for 30 minutes next Wednesday from 3:30 to 4 p.m. Come with your questions if they're not answered today. Thank you for using the chat for your questions. Those have been answered as we go. And then on the next slide, we've got 2 other workshops in this series. The dates have not yet been set, but thanks to your questions and the responses you've provided in the survey, we've gotten some feedback, and I think we'll either have a 4th workshop or we'll work into one of these workshops more info on the challenges and concerns around brownfield, mineland redevelopment for solar. Okay, I just took up too many minutes. Let me turn it over to all of you for questions. Questions for presenters, clarifying questions. We have questions for you if anyone wants to talk about any potential sites or projects they're looking at, or if you want to talk about any concerns you're hearing from your communities or other stakeholders, things you're hearing in terms of needing technical assistance or additional information. I can stay on beyond the hour to jot down your questions and hopefully provide some responses. Sue, I think we can kill the slides so we can all be on screen. Folks, feel free to come off mute, turn on your camera, or raise your hand. Yes, Nicole.
Forgive me, I came late, so hopefully someone can answer this. Can you tell me the difference between brownfields and abandoned mine lands?
I can take a stab at that, and then I think it was covered in Amanda's presentation, but abandoned mine lands is a technical term for SMACRA law, post 1977. Mines and brownfields is more of a general term for hazardous or potentially hazardous sites. Amanda, can you add to that?
Yeah, you did a good job, except for abandoned mine lands are the pre-law. So they were mined before 1977, before there was federal law to require cleanup. So it's like a very specific term for a coal mine land, whereas brownfield's a more general term that could include AMLs, it could include landfills, it could include other industrial sites. And I'll share my slides with you, Nicole.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Other questions? You can raise your physical hand, your virtual hand, and just come on camera.
Yeah, and I asked, this is Brian, and I asked the question in the chat earlier. I am just communities who are on the call now who actually are thinking about specific projects. I'd be interested in just kind of knowing kind of, what kind of projects are you looking at? What, is it a mineland project? Is it a brownfield? And just so we can start to get a sense of how we can connect communities who are interested in taking action with resources that they may be able to use.
Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you. So I asked you this in a direct message, Val, but can you please expand on, your response regarding the outreach to municipalities with the Nature Conservancy?
Sure. So this is our first attempt to do outreach to communities in Illinois. We try to contact energy transition communities specifically, so communities that have had a coal mine or are adjacent to a county with a coal mine or other disturbed lands. And we will continue this conversation through this series of workshops, but as Brian said, if you can contact us, let us know what resources you might need. We do have some grant support where we might be able to provide or create the resources and tools you need. This upcoming workshop, the second workshop, is focused on some of those tools. So we'll hear from Repowering America. We'll talk more about the federal tax credits and the state incentives that are available.
And we should also mention the technical assistance available through the TIC-TAC, Thriving Communities Technical Assistance, something, I can't remember, that is available actually in Illinois, and GPI is participating along with some other organizations in providing that technical assistance for grants. There was a hand up, Jennifer, I think. Has
Yep, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, so I just wanted to know, what is the response or that could be given or should be given when people are concerned about, will this cause me cancer later on? Will this cause me to be sick? Because it's just a reality that, when you don't know, you just don't know. So how are you addressing that, or if it's come up?
Do you think health concerns do come up? There's certainly concerns about the redevelopment of these sites. For those of you who work on this more in the day in, day out, any responses for Jennifer?
Jennifer, are you referring to the solar development or to just generally the redevelopment or use of some of these contaminated sites?
Well, actually both. So with the solar development, what are the health implications for that? And then also redeveloping this land that has been contaminated or possibly contaminated already previously.
Okay, well, I can address the solar side of that. I would leave the second question to the people who are more familiar with the nuances of redeveloping and restoring contaminated sites. The solar impacts or risks associated with it are very, very small, if any. There has been some speculation about kind of components within solar panels that could somehow escape and get into the environment, and that is really entirely speculative. There have been no instances ever of contamination by a solar panel into the groundwater or into the soils. There is some concern that has been that is still being investigated, although it's largely fairly small, about if you dispose of used up solar panels in landfills, is there a contamination risk in that instance? Generally, the answer is no, but there's still some ongoing research on that, and also kind of efforts to not put them in landfills and put them, recycle them. But the actual kind of solar on the land there has been really no identification of any vector for contamination in that instance. I don't know if that's answering your question. Hopefully.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Brian. So yeah, the solar itself poses very little risk to human health, but when you install the solar, there's certain activities that might possibly create exposure to contaminated materials. So for example, projects might be on sites that are what are called capped. There's an impermeable cap that covers the contaminated soils. And if you were developing solar in a way that punctured that cap, that could create an exposure that we wouldn't want to see. Also, the construction of solar projects may involve, earth moving equipment, and dust gets up into the air. And so, those are issues that you'd want to make sure are avoided or, entirely mitigated. I think a principle for this redevelopment should be it does not expose the community to anything new. Many of these communities have been exposed to contaminants for decades, and the last thing we want to do is have clean energy be another version of creating problems for that community. So if that situation were to exist, or there was a risk of that kind of exposure that was significant, I mean, I think our sense would be that's not the appropriate redevelopment use.
So
Yeah.
that was helpful, and I'm sorry, I'm on my cell phone, so I can't see Mr. Johnson sounds like that was who was speaking. So what I understood you to say is that, since they've already been exposed to this for a long time, that if for some reason, they would start the solar project, and then there would be, they go too far, say they dig too deep, they may potentially re-expose, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a possibility. There are ways to get around that. I mean, obviously, you know, there are engineering kind of specifications you could use to make sure you don't punch through the cap. And there may be caps that are just inappropriate, and you wouldn't want to put a solar project on that cap because of the materials or the thickness or whatever. So I'm not a project engineer, so I can't tell you all the details of doing that. But
So I'm sorry.
but there are many situations, putting clean energy on a mineland after it's been remediated, after those contamination risks are gone. And some sites don't have contamination. They may be degraded because of the previous mining use or whatever, but they don't have a contamination problem that would pose a threat to human health.
So in part of the project, and I'm just asking for my understanding, as part of the project, then you would then be, I guess, notifying communities of there was exposure, this project may potentially expose again. So communities would be notified of that, and the project start.
Yeah, well, we think that it's important to engage communities early on in any planning for these kinds of projects. So those concerns could surface early, and those concerns could be addressed or looked at or researched, or a plan would come up to avoid those impacts. And then also, you know, the regulatory agencies have a role and responsibility for, you know, helping to make sure these communities don't get re-exposed again. And so, you know, I don't know if, you know, there's anybody here who wants to speak to that, but I think that, you know, the Illinois EPA, for example, and maybe Jacob could speak to that, you know, are there in part to help communities avoid those kinds of exposures.
Yeah, I can kind of speak on that a little bit. So specifically, the sites that are enrolled in site remediation, or the sites that are going through brownfield redevelopment, there are certain standards, and these consultants and contractors are very familiar with the possibility of contaminants migrating off site, or some sort of potential there. So in those cases, there may be something like air monitoring or continued groundwater monitoring that will occur. You know, if there's dust that's being stirred up, they can perform air monitoring at the edges of the facility, or at the you know, in the groundwater, they can do monitoring there every quarter. There's different institutional controls like that can be done. Also, if it's not, you know, if it's a site that somebody's concerned about that has just remained degraded, you can always approach your community about trying to get it redeveloped. And that's always a good option too. Hopefully that kind of clarified things a little bit.
Yeah, I think I'd like to maybe possibly, you know more, because the air quality monitoring, that's going to be written, of course, in the development plan. There will be funds set aside to actually do that, and then, you know, will there be things written in there that okay, upon the air quality monitoring, of course, the project will stop. You know, those sorts of things would be written in the plans.
Yes. So for almost every one of our plans, there's a work plan and a safety plan, and those kind of controls are laid out in those plans.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. All right. I think I'll let someone else have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jennifer. I see a hand up from Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Josh Sage, Boone County Conservation District. And to Brian's, with respect to Brian's question earlier about projects that we are all working on, I have a doozy for the group. The Boone County Conservation District owns a piece of property. It's an EPA Superfund site. Conservation District owns the property. City of Belvedere manages the fencing and vegetation. Since 2018, we've been in the process of trying to get a solar array placed on the landfill. Working through the process, come to find out there's a restrictive covenant placed on the landfill that is extremely restrictive to the point where we cannot put anything on the landfill unless that covenant is modified. We need to get in front of a judge to modify that covenant. I'm asking the whole group, are there any sources out there, funding sources to help fund legal counsel to work through some of these hurdles? I'm sure my hurdles is exceptional, but I'm sure there's other hurdles out there, and I'm going to be in probably tens of thousands in legal fees to try and get this covenant modified. So how many people left after I started talking? It's a tough one. It's a tough one. I'm meeting with the Boone County State's Attorney and City of Belvedere Attorney next week to see what they can help with, and then after that, US EPA will help a little bit, but they're not gonna foot the bill for the majority of the legal work.
And it's a great question. It's actually something that we did some work in the past in Minnesota and encountered a number of similar things, kind of legal instruments that are basically were put in place to protect, right, protect the community or protect contamination that are then getting in the way for constructive reuse of the site, because no one anticipated doing things like solar or other kinds of development proposals, off the top of my head, I don't know of a funding mechanism for that legal assistance. There are, however, some EPA does have some technical assistance available at different regional offices. The national, I should say, the US EPA does, that can help on a project by project basis, and maybe that's something we can take a look at. We did actually tap into that for one of the projects that we looked at in a few years ago when we were doing this work in Minnesota, and actually were able to get some assistance from that. It wasn't funding, but it was legal assistance. So
yeah, we've been in talks with Illinois EPA,
okay.
Illinois EPA and US EPA, and the covenant states that every resident in Belvedere and Boone County must agree to a change in use, basically. So it's like, okay, how do you get permission from all of the residents? And US EPA is willing to step in and do basically public hearings to hopefully get some feedback from the public, and then we take that to a judge with the covenant, and hopefully between everything the US EPA has gathered in public comment and a judge saying, wow, this is extremely restrictive, this needs to be modified. That's kind of what we're hanging our hats on. So US EPA has offered, and that's what they're going to do if we can get it that far. So
well, I'm interested in how that moves forward, because this is not an uncommon glitch to come up in these kinds of projects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If it goes to court, it'll probably be case law that other attorneys study. I imagine. I could be wrong, but it'll be interesting.
Yeah, this is a perfect illustration of why these projects are more complicated, more expensive than other sites. You know, when you talk to a developer about a greenfield versus a brownfield, they'll say about the greenfield, well, there are these 6 steps I have to do. I know how much each one's going to cost roughly, and then there's a brownfield site, and there's that 6 same steps, but I don't know how much they're gonna cost. And then there are additional steps that I don't even know about yet. And so everything we can do to kind of reduce those steps, make them less expensive so that they look the same to the developer as a greenfield site. That's what it's really gonna take, and that's why the incentives are important. That's why these regulatory and permitting reforms are gonna be so important. And I think what you're saying in Boone County is that is, I guess, you could almost categorize that as a permitting reform, but it's that restriction, makes it very, very difficult to get a permit. And the only way to accelerate or get around that is to change that covenant or easement.
And it was one of the first. I mean, this was done in 1989, 1990. So, I mean,
Yeah.
one of the first ones to ever be completed, and they really they did a good job.
Made sense at the time, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank
Thanks,
you.
Josh. Thanks, everyone. Additional questions or comments? Additional information we could bring to you in a future workshop. I've written down what are the community engagement opportunities, when do those come up? Continuing conversations around concerns, challenges, site de-risking. Okay, well, if nothing else now, Nels, go ahead. See your hand up.
No, I was just gonna say thank you so much. This has been a great opportunity to learn, and I always enjoy hearing the questions that come up. It's always really informative.
Great. Yes, I hope this has been useful. Again, this is workshop 1 out of 3.5 because we have an optional discussion session coming up next Wednesday for 30 minutes in case none of your questions have been answered today. And then workshop 2 on resources, tools, incentives, and workshop 3 currently envisioned as talking about and hearing from solar developers and hearing some case studies on how to develop solar on these lands. Thank you, everyone. Go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, I just want to say that I will be sending out links to the presentations and the recordings, links to register for the next session, and we'll continue to keep you up to date on when we have dates for the other workshops. So keep watching your email. We'll keep you informed on everything that's coming up.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you so much for the terrific presentations. Thank you all for your participation, your questions and comments. Hope to see you on a future workshop. Bye.